plug for Ms. Patel's dopey site that's a competition to Facebook. Okay, the story at hand, the big story to me as a podcaster, has to do with Joe Rogan and Spotify and the whole Neil Young thing and what's going on with him. And to those of you who don't know, I'll recap real quickly. Now, rocker Neil Young, back on January 24th, a couple weeks ago, he started reporting on NPR. Now, this makes sense. Neil Young on NPR. Okay, and he's had a story, and it seemed like a fit for his online newspaper. Yeah, Neil Young has an online newspaper. It's called the Times-Contrarian. Okay, and he had certain things to say, and it talked about, actually it was an open letter to Spotify Technology, published back on the 24th. It was an open letter that was signed by other teachers and scientists, medical professionals, urging Spotify, the streaming giant, to address what they deemed false information about COVID-19 vaccines on Joe Rogan's podcast. Now, Mr. Young would typically just repost the story, said a person familiar with his site. Instead, the singer decided to pen his own letter about Spotify, saying basically, you can have Joe Rogan, you can have Neil Young, but not both. The 76-year-old activist, artist, and I'm glad the Wall Street Journal called him this. This is where I got the story, by the way, Wall Street Journal. The 76-year-old activist artist, he wrote to both his management and his record label asking they remove the music immediately. 2 days later, Mr. Young's record label, Warner, told Spotify to take down the music, and Spotify obliged. Now, for most of the week after Mr. Young's ultimatum, it didn't feel like a crisis at Spotify, said people inside the company. But gradually, as other artists and podcasters followed Mr. Young's lead, 5 days after Young's first volley, Spotify executives decided that they had to act before the weekend was over and before the problem snowballed. But they were too slow to respond. In fact, we were too slow to respond. And this is Chief Executive Daniel Ek. He's the Spotify guy, okay? He said during an interview. In fact, the company had been looking for ways to respond to the open letter before Mr. Young's demands even surfaced. And that's on me, says Mr. Ek. Good for him for stepping up. Now, the spat has been a rude wake-up call for Spotify as it seeks to become the world's largest audio company, not just podcast supplier. They're already that. But they want to become the world's largest audio company, offering all audio material. Now, like Facebook and YouTube, Spotify started as a tech platform agnostic to what it hosted. But now it's moving towards a media company that's responsible for what it distributes. Now, the shift means, whether they like it or not, that the company is confronting difficult decisions about content that can spark heated reactions from consumers, employees, artists, and podcasters. Now, Mr. Ek, in the interview, resisted being pinned down as a publisher. He said it's still debatable whether YouTube or Facebook are tech platforms or media platforms. I don't think you can define exactly what Spotify is either. Fair enough. Now, this week, Spotify reported it had 406 million monthly active users. I'm included. Now, that's up 18% from the year before. Its advertising revenue is largely tied to podcasting, and it's up 40%. So business is good for Spotify. Now, Mr. Young has acted on his principles before, leading to friction with the music industry. Back in 2010, and I remember when this happened, he crusaded for better digital sound quality and created Pono, his high-resolution music player and download service. He pulled his music from streaming services temporarily in 2015 over sound quality objections. On his website in recent days, he has described Spotify's sound as crappy, degraded, and neutered, and encouraged people to leave the service. Now, just a footnote, Neil Young's spot on when it comes to this, okay? One of the biggest costs of any streaming service is bandwidth. And if you condense material, you save bandwidth. To condense a podcast spoken word, not so bad. When you condense music, especially when listened to by the artist who created it, that can be a big deal. Now, if you're putting something out there, if you're listening to music on your Alexa player at the pool, you're not going to hear it so much. If you're in a soundproof room with your eyes closed and the room darkened, trying to listen to every nuance of the instruments, yeah, you're going to hear it. And you know the artists are that way because they created the music. They're audiophiles, worse than I am, okay? But basically, that open letter from Neil Young, this sparked Neil Young's action. It cited a podcast episode where Joe Rogan spoke with Dr. Robert Malone. He's a virologist who worked on research into several mRNA COVID-19 vaccines, but he's now critical of the treatments. Now, the signatories on the letter accused Mr. Rogan's podcast of promoting baseless conspiracy theories. Mr. Young echoed this critique in his January 24th letter, but then he took it down later as different media outlets began to write about it. Translation, he was afraid he'd get sued. So it is all about the money, isn't it? Now, let me tell you about Neil Young, just a little bit about Neil Young and how he differs from many other artists in three ways. First of all, very few young people listen to Neil Young. It's because it's an older genre of music. I'm not saying bad things about Neil Young. I like his music. But I'm not a young person, okay? That's number one. Number two, he's 76 years old, and he's worth $200 million. Now, taking his music off of Spotify costs him some money. It does. But when you're 76 and you have $200 million, the money he's losing off of Spotify is a rounding error. So he's going to stand with his principles before collecting the pennies that he may get from Spotify, okay? And as far as that goes, I respect him because he's standing up for what he believes. And he's putting his money where his mouth is, by the way. He's just not saying, I think that everybody should be banned. He's saying, take my intellectual property off your site. Big difference, okay? Now, throughout discussions on January 25th, Mr. Young's management team labeled Warner Music Group weighed whether or not to wait for Spotify to respond. Well, ends up that they didn't. Now, as his music was coming down, Mr. Young wrote on his website, I sincerely hope that other artists and record companies will move off the Spotify platform and stop supporting Spotify's deadly misinformation about COVID. He began pointing fans to where his music was available, like Apple Music, Amazon.com, other sites where you can pick up Neil Young's music. In other words, hey, I'm off Spotify, but that's okay. You can get it here instead of there. Now, on the day Mr. Young's music came down, Spotify issued a written statement saying, quote, we want all the world's music and audio content to be available on Spotify for Spotify users. With that comes a great responsibility in balancing both safety for listeners and freedom for creators. Now, Spotify said that they had content policies in place, and they had removed over 20,000 COVID-19 related podcast episodes during the pandemic, adding, we regret Neil's decision to remove his music from Spotify, but we hope to have him back soon. Okay, they removed over 20,000 podcasts because they didn't like the content. Now, here's my note to Spotify. You are either an agnostic platform for information or you're not. If you're taking down 20,000 podcasts, you're not. Now, on January 27th, Spotify's competitors began welcoming new users and tweets supporting Mr. Young. SiriusXM Inc. revived Mr. Young's satellite and streaming channel. In other words, you can listen to the Neil Young channel now, okay, on SiriusXM. Who doesn't put any controversial information out there, by the way? None, not any. Laugh, laugh, chuckle, chuckle. Now, record labels were fielding calls from artists and artist managers inquiring about taking their own music down, said industry executives. They began to pressure Spotify to do more, finding frustrating what they perceived to be the company's lack of a real response. Now, Mr. Eck offered to meet with Mr. Young several times. Neil Young said no thanks. Now, on January 28th, singer-songwriter Joni Mitchell, who's also signed to Warner Music Group and shares a manager with Neil Young, joined him in quitting Spotify. Ms. Mitchell said, "Irresponsible people are spreading lies that are costing people their lives," she said. Other peers of Mr. Young later issued similar statements, including David Crosby, Stephen Stills, and David Nash. Neo-soul singer India Ari said she too wanted to remove her music and podcast based on Mr. Rogan's discussions about race. Podcasters who pulled their shows included Brene Brown, who tweeted on January 29th that she wouldn't produce more for the service until further notice. Okay, now Spotify, once upon a time, Spotify's content challenge was foreshadowed by a dust-up back in 2018 over the streaming service's decision to remove R&B star R. Kelly and rapper Temptation. Okay, I never heard of the guy, but I'm not into rap music. But they removed their information, their content from the playlists because of abuse allegations. R. Kelly and this Temptation guy, they had abuse allegations, okay? So they pulled their content based on that. The company introduced a hate and hateful content policy, which tossed off a debate whether the streaming service should punish artists alleged bad behavior. Alleged, because R. Kelly at that time and this Temptation guy were never charged with anything. They were accused of something, which that's a big difference. I could accuse anybody of anything, okay? Now, it drew some criticism across the music industry. Some said the policy appeared only to target black men. Okay, so we made it about race again. Now, as part of its ambition to become an audio giant, Spotify invested in dozens of people working on its trust and safety team, plus outside support and advisors, according to people within the company. Spotify didn't remove any of Mr. Rogan's vaccine-related episodes after this. But now, while Spotify previously had removed 40 other episodes for policy violations, like Alex Jones, none of them has been related to the pandemic. Now, Mr. Eck in his blog indicated his commitment to open dialogue and an all creators welcome ethos. He personally disagrees with many of his on his service, he said, but adding that it's important to me that we don't take on the position of being content censor. Too late. You already have. At other platforms like Facebook or YouTube, executives have also struggled to balance being open to all voices and being safe for users. Now, over the years, they have implemented extensive content policies and created teams to flag materials they deem inappropriate or dangerous. Many platforms have been called on to answer regulators and lawmakers about ways to prevent the discrimination of information that is widely considered false. In some cases, the platforms ban or suspend users. Now, last Sunday night, Rogan posted a conciliatory video to his Instagram, pledging to be more balanced and informed about controversial topics and artists. I read the video, the Instagram video, and it was quite sincere in my opinion. Now, the post was Mr. Rogan's own initiative, but came as a relief to people inside Spotify. It's a strange responsibility to have this many viewers and listeners, he said in the video. That's Rogan. I'm going to do my best to balance things out. Now, basically, in a nutshell, you can go on to Instagram and watch his video if you like. But in a nutshell, Joe Rogan said, look, I'm going to do a better job of trying to have more balanced people on the show. In other words, he's not saying he's not going to have doctors that are anti-vaxxers on. He's saying he'll have an anti-vaxxer, then he'll have a pro-vaxxer. In other words, point, counterpoint, more balanced content. That's the best way to do it, and I like the way he did it. Now, record executives say they felt Mr. Rogan's response was genuine and pointed out that he addressed Mr. Young directly, a human element they found missing from Spotify's response. But then Joe Rogan is not, I guess you could say he's a a media, an executive, but he's more of a media guy. That's why he's so popular. That's why his podcasts are that's why his podcast is number one. Okay.